She slowed down, said she needed to take a call, and drove off before I could even shut the passenger door. The words still echoed in my head as the gravel crunched beneath my shoes. I stood on the side of Route 302, a paper coffee cup sweating in my hand, its cardboard rim softening with each pulse of rain-soaked air. The sky was bruised purple, one of those cold Vermont dusks that pretends it's only evening, but the darkness already knows better. Crickets hummed somewhere in the grass, and her taillights vanished into a smear of red and mist. I waited. Maybe she'd turn around. Maybe it was just a moment, a flare of temper, a misunderstanding. But the sound of her engine faded like a secret being swallowed. The cup trembled slightly in my hand. I blamed it on the chill. "All right," I murmured to the empty road. "All right, Thomas. Walk." So I did. 2 miles to the diner. That's what the green highway sign said, though it might as well have been 20. My shoes weren't made for walking, not on gravel. Every step was a scrape of disbelief. I kept thinking about the way she'd said it. "We'll handle things from here." What things? The house? The account? Me? When I was still an architect, I used to say that walls were honest. They showed the hand that built them. You could tell if someone built in anger, or fear, or pride. The way Emily spoke tonight, it was the sound of someone laying bricks around herself. By the time the flickering red neon sign of Grace's Diner came into view, my phone buzzed at 6%. The screen light felt harsh against the dim street. I called for a cab, but the dispatcher's voice was mechanical, distant. "Earliest we can do is 40 minutes, sir." "Maybe longer. Weather's turning." "All right," I said quietly. "I'll wait." Inside, the diner smelled like old coffee and fried onions. A jukebox in the corner crooned Sinatra. All or nothing at all. The place was nearly empty, save for a trucker slumped over a plate of pancakes and a waitress with tired kindness in her eyes. Her name tag said Grace, as if the universe had a sense of humor. She noticed the coffee cup still in my hand before she noticed me. "You look like you could use something hot that isn't cardboard," she said. Voice gentle but firm. I smiled faintly. "That obvious?" "Only because I've seen it before." "Sit down, hun." I took a booth near the window. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, filling the silence between us. Grace poured from the pot without asking, the steam rising like a ghost between us. "You driving far tonight?" She asked. "Not anymore," I said. "Guess my ride ended early." She tilted her head, studying me. "You get stranded?" "Something like that." The coffee was bitter, a kind of bitterness that makes you aware of your tongue, your age, your mistakes. Grace leaned against the counter, wiping her hands on a towel. "Well, if you need to call someone, my phone's dying." She nodded quietly. Then after a moment, "You okay, sir?" I looked at her, really looked. Maybe it was the kindness in her face, or maybe I just needed to say it out loud. "My daughter dropped me off on the highway." The words sounded foreign, like someone else's confession. Grace froze for a second, towel still in her hand. "On purpose?" She said she needed to take a call. I let out a dry laugh. She was right. It was a call, all right. Just not the kind you hang up from. Grace blinked slowly, then poured me a refill. "People do cruel things in soft voices," she said. The jukebox changed songs. "Fly Me to the Moon." Somewhere in that melody, my chest ached. A week ago, Emily had hugged me after Christmas dinner. Jason was there, smiling too widely, talking about modernizing finances. I'd brushed it off. Families talk money like they talk weather, with superstition and avoidance. Now I wasn't sure if any of it had been real. Grace slid a small plate toward me, 2 slices of pie, one clearly meant to be shared. "On the house," she said. "I don't want to take advantage." "Don't flatter yourself," she said with a faint smirk. "You're doing me a favor." "I get lonely on slow nights," I smiled back barely. "Then we're both keeping each other company." For a few minutes, silence did the talking. The trucker paid his bill, jingled out into the night. My phone buzzed once, 3% now. The cab company texted, "Delay due to rain." 25 min more. Grace refilled the cup again. "You want me to plug that in behind the counter?" "Phone's dying." I shook my head. "Let it die." "Some calls can wait." She gave me a look, the kind that held both pity and respect. You're a proud man, huh? Just tired of building things that fall apart. The bell above the diner door rattled in the wind. I looked through the glass. Rain started to drizzle, soft but steady, blurring the taillights of cars passing in the distance. Grace followed my gaze. Someone you built something for? My daughter, I said quietly. I built her a home, drew every inch of it myself. She told her friends her husband designed it. Grace's eyes softened. And tonight? I looked at the road, the rain, the streaks of red light fading into the dark. Tonight she showed me it's not my home anymore. The jukebox clicked, and the track restarted. Sinatra again, same song, same notes, looping back like memory. Grace refilled my cup one last time. Cab'll be here soon, she said. I nodded, gathering my coat. The coffee steamed against the cool air, the cup trembling slightly in my grip. As I stepped outside, the rain touched my face. Cold, clean, uninvited. I turned toward the distant highway where her car had disappeared, and under my breath, barely audible even to myself, I whispered, I built her a home. She built a wall. Mornings in my house had a quiet kind of rhythm. The kind you don't notice until it's gone. Light slipped through the thin curtains in long, pale stripes, laying across the hardwood like old plans rolled out for inspection. The kettle hissed, the wall clock ticked, and sometimes, when I forgot myself, I caught my hand reaching toward the piano in the corner, half expecting Laura to be there, humming as she played. But the piano hadn't been opened in years. Its lid gathered dust, the same way her perfume still lingered faintly in the air whenever the window caught a certain breeze. I was 52 when she died. Heart condition, the quiet thief of good women. I remember the doctor's voice, calm and practiced, like reading blueprints for a life I hadn't approved. By the time I retired, I was 58, my left hand still tingling from the mild stroke that ended my architectural career. I'd built homes for strangers all my life, yet the one thing I couldn't rebuild was the space Laura left behind. So, I kept what I could, her piano, my drafting table, and the craftsman house we'd restored together. Everything else was simplified. Emily used to joke that I lived like a monk. Dad, she'd say, standing in the doorway with her phone in hand, you know there's an app for groceries now? I like seeing what I buy, I'd reply. Some things shouldn't come in boxes. She'd laugh, but there was always a flicker of impatience behind it. She was her mother's mind and my stubbornness, a dangerous combination. When she got into Columbia for her grad program, I wired her the tuition. When she got married 2 years later, I paid for the reception. When she and Jason bought their townhouse in Boston, I transferred another $180,000 for the down payment. All told, I'd spent nearly $480,000 over 15 years, the better part of my savings. I didn't think of it as generosity. It was simply what fathers did. The money never bothered me. What bothered me was the way they spoke about it later, as if it had come from the sky. Jason, with his polished grin and tailored suits, once patted me on the back at dinner and said, "You've been such a blessing." Tom, really. We'll make sure you're comfortable when the time comes. I remember the phrase, "when the time comes," lodging like a splinter in my mind. One afternoon, Emily called while I was sketching at my drafting table. The pencil's clack against the glass surface was steady, the sound of control. "Dad," she said, voice sweet but purposeful. "Maybe you should sell the house." "It's too much for you alone," I paused. The line between us hummed. "That house is all that's left of her, Emily. Mom wouldn't want you alone in there. Mom wouldn't want me erased," I said softly. Silence. Then her sigh, small but sharp. "You make everything sound so dramatic." "I'm an architect," I said. "Drama's in the structure," she laughed awkwardly, and changed the subject. That's how our conversations went. Polite fencing matches disguised as concern. When Jason suggested they modernize their duplex last summer, I volunteered to help. It felt good to hold a pencil again, to draw plans, to smell fresh sawdust. I stayed in their guest room for 3 weeks, repairing window trims and sketching floor layouts while Jason worked his spreadsheets. "Careful, Tom," he'd joke. "We wouldn't want the place looking too vintage." I bit my tongue. He was the kind of man who called sentimentality a liability. When the contractor fell through, I covered some costs, $72,000 wired from my account. Just a temporary loan, Emily had said. But the words were never spoken again. By the end of that renovation, I noticed something subtle. They stopped asking what I thought. Jason made decisions over dinner. Emily nodded. And I sat there with my fork poised mid-air, realizing I'd become part of the furniture. That's when I met Grace. She worked at the diner down the hill from their place. Charlie's? Stop, a small brick and neon, place wedged between a laundromat and a florist. I'd go there mornings after finishing the day's drawings. She'd bring me coffee in a chipped mug, no questions asked. Retired or just avoiding something? She asked one morning, her smile half teasing. Little of both, I said. She poured another cup. Well, you're good company either way. There was something grounding about her. No pretense, no strategy. She'd lost her husband in a construction accident years back and understood silence in ways most people fear it. She didn't try to fix anything. She just noticed. The last morning before I left Boston, she handed me a paper cup and said, "For the road, architect." That was the same cup Emily handed me days later, right before she drove away. Back then, though, I didn't see any of it coming. When I returned home, the house felt smaller. Dust had settled on the piano keys like gray snow. I sat down, pressed one key, and winced at the flat note. Laura used to say a house without music eventually forgets how to breathe. Maybe mine already had. I started to sort old drawings, more out of habit than hope. Every line I'd ever drawn, for clients, for homes, for dreams that never materialized, ended up in a flat wooden drawer. My hand still knew the motion: measure, mark, erase, adjust. Sometimes in the middle of sketching, I'd catch myself thinking about Emily's laughter when she was small, the way she'd tug my sleeve and say, "Make me a castle, Daddy. I built her a dollhouse once. Real wood, not plastic. Tiny windows with glass panes, stairs that curved." She used to sit beside me while I worked, her breath fogging the glass of my magnifier lamp. The last time I saw her look at me like that was the day she defended her thesis. She hugged me tight afterward, eyes wet. "Couldn't have done it without you," she'd said, and I believed her. But belief ages, like paint left out in the sun. By the fall, before everything happened, our calls had thinned out, once a week, then every other. Conversations grew shorter, transactional. "Dad, can you send the tax statement?" "Dad, do you still have Mom's ring receipts?" I tried to bridge the distance. I invited them for Thanksgiving, but they said they were visiting Jason's parents in New York. I sent a message on Christmas Eve. "Trees up." First one without your mom. No reply until morning. A polite heart emoji and, "Merry Christmas, Dad. Love you." That was all. I don't think abandonment happens in one day. It's an erosion. Slow, silent, one layer of trust gone at a time. By the time you realize what's left, it's already unlivable. The night before the highway, I'd gone back to Boston for the last touch-ups on their guest room. Jason was out late, and Emily had opened a bottle of wine. We sat in the kitchen. She looked tired, or maybe I just wanted to believe she was tired, not distant. "Dad," she said, tracing the rim of her glass, "Jason thinks maybe you should take it easy for a while." "You've done so much," I smiled. "That's kind of the job description of a father." She looked up, her expression tightening. "You've given enough." Something in her tone, the finality of it, made me set my glass down. "Enough for who?" "For yourself," she said quickly. "You need to stop worrying about us." "But worrying's all I've got left." She sighed, shaking her head. "You make it sound like a punishment." "I make it sound like love," I said. She didn't answer. That silence, that long, wordless stretch between us, felt like the beginning of something ending. Now, standing in the diner days later, with Grace pouring me coffee under the hum of fluorescent light, I could feel it all replaying. Every choice, every check, every small moment where I'd mistaken gratitude for connection. She smiled softly when she caught me staring into the dark coffee. "You look like a man solving a riddle," she said. "I think I was the riddle," I replied. Grace chuckled. Then maybe stop looking for the answer in people who already stopped asking the question. Her words landed heavier than she knew. It wasn't just that my daughter left me on the road. It was that she'd been driving away for years. I'd just finally stopped chasing the car. The first crack never sounds like breaking. It sounds like laughter, the kind that hides discomfort behind polished teeth. That night, months before the road, we were at a restaurant near the harbor. Jason had picked it, of course, a place where the menu came on tablets and water was served with lemon slices that looked rehearsed. Emily sat across from me, scrolling absently through her phone. Jason leaned back, swirling his wine. "Tom," he said suddenly, "you still using paper checks?" I smiled faintly. "When it comes to bills, yes." "I like records you can hold," Jason chuckled, eyes glinting with that kind of pity reserved for people you've already dismissed. "Man, that's adorable. My dad used to do that until he locked himself out of his account one too many times." Emily laughed, not cruelly, but reflexively. Then she caught my expression and tried to soften it. "Dad, you really don't get how modern things work." "Maybe," I said. "But they still seem to work well enough to pay for this dinner." She blinked, unsure if I meant it as a joke. Jason cleared his throat, grinning tightly. When the check came, I reached for it. They didn't even notice. Jason was already discussing some crypto opportunity with a friend over text. I signed my name slowly, deliberately, pen against paper, a ritual older than both of them. That night, on the walk back to the car, Emily looped her arm through mine out of habit. I almost pretended nothing had changed. Almost. But something had. By the time spring came, I could feel her tone shifting, small adjustments in how she spoke to me. Like tightening screws. "Dad," she said one afternoon, "can you bring the property papers when you visit?" Jason wants to help simplify things. "Papers?" "Yeah, just, the deeds, the titles, the mortgage info, so we can help you manage it better." I hesitated. "Manage or transfer?" She frowned. "Don't make it sound sinister. We just want to make sure everything's organized." That was the word she used. Organized. The same word I'd used years ago when labeling her art supplies in plastic bins. I remember how she'd rolled her eyes then, calling it too controlling. Funny how language circles back to bite its maker. The weekend visit started simply enough. I brought the folders she'd asked for, a neat stack, every page marked with tabs. She smiled as she placed them in the car's trunk, her perfume soft and floral, the same scent Laura used to wear on Sundays. We drove out of Boston around noon. The highway shimmered in the early light, lined with trees shedding the last of their blossoms. I tried to keep the mood light, asked about her projects. Her clients, the new duplex tenants. She gave short answers. Distracted, about an hour in, she said casually, Jason's thinking we might move your house funds into a joint trust. That way it's safer." I looked at her. "Safer for whom?" "For all of us," she said, eyes fixed on the road. The word us had a way of excluding me, even as it claimed to include me. "I already have a trust," I said quietly. "Your mother and I set it up years ago." "I know," she said, her tone sharpening slightly. "But things change, Dad. Laws change. Jason knows more about these things." I turned my gaze to the passing fields, the fences flashing by in rhythm with my pulse. "When I built your first dollhouse," I said, "I made sure the walls were double-braced, safe enough for a child's clumsy hands. Didn't need anyone else to tell me how to do it." She sighed. "Dad, this isn't about pride." "No," I murmured. "It's about control." The air in the car thickened. Even the hum of the tires sounded tense. Half an hour later, Jason called. Emily put him on speaker. "Hey, babe," his voice drawled through the static. "Did he bring the papers?" "I did," she said. "They're in the trunk." "Good. Make sure your dad signs before he forgets again." I clenched my jaw, watching the horizon blur. Emily's fingers tightened on the wheel. "Jason," she said sharply. "Not funny," he laughed. "Come on, Em. I'm just saying, you know how he gets with details." I said nothing. My silence was heavier than anger. It filled the space like fog, seeping into the seams of the car. When the call ended, Emily cleared her throat. "You know he doesn't mean anything by that." "I know exactly what he means," I said. "Dad, it's fine," I interrupted. My tone was calm, steady. the kind of calm that makes other people uneasy. After that, the road stretched long and empty between us. She turned up the radio, but neither of us was listening. The car smelled faintly of her perfume, white jasmine and rain, the bottle label had said. But all I could think about was Laura's scent after gardening, earth and roses and sunlight. When we pulled into the rest stop, the sun had started to sink. The clouds were streaked violet, like bruises spreading across the sky. "I just need a minute," Emily said, parking near the vending machines. "Of course." I reached for the door handle, but before I could step out, she spoke again, voice clipped, rehearsed. "Dad, I think you've done enough. We'll handle things from here." I froze. "Handle what?" "Everything," she said. Then she opened her door, walked around the car, and set a paper cup in my hand. It was still warm. I could smell the faint sweetness of vanilla creamer, her favorite. "Wait," I said. "What's going on?" She didn't answer. She looked down at the gravel, then at me, and for the first time, I saw not frustration or fatigue, but fear. The kind that comes from guilt you're still justifying. "I just need space," she whispered. "You'll understand later, Emily." But the door slammed. Headlights cut through the dusk. The gravel spat against my shoes. And then she was gone, the faint trace of her perfume mixing with the exhaust. Later that night, back at the diner, I sat in the same booth as before. Grace poured coffee without asking. The neon sign outside flickered against the window, staining the table in red and blue pulses. "You look like you've been hit by something you didn't see coming," she said. I managed a thin smile. "Something like that." She set the pot down gently. "Some people forget the hands that held them up," she said. "Don't let that be your story." I looked at her, the corners of her eyes crinkled with the kind of empathy that doesn't need questions. "I won't," I said. My voice surprised me, low, steady, almost cold. Grace studied me a moment longer, then nodded. "Good, because the world's full of people who confuse kindness for weakness." I took a sip of the coffee. It was stronger than I remembered, bitter but grounding. Outside, the rain had started again, faint at first, then steadier, relentless. I didn't speak. Didn't need to. Inside me, something subtle shifted, the same way a structure groans before it settles into its final form. The hurt didn't fade. It just changed density, from something that bled to something that braced. And for the first time in years, I stopped blaming the walls for being sturdy. The certified envelope felt heavier than its size when I held it against my chest. My name, Mr. Thomas Reed, co-signer, stamped in bold black, looked like a verdict. I stood at the kitchen counter with the light above me humming, the kettle cold and indifferent on the stove. The house smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper, a violin scratch on a memory I couldn't quiet. Inside the envelope was a letterhead I recognized from a dozen meetings, Barnes & Cooper LLP, serifed and professional. The draft attached listed my house as subject to property consolidation upon incapacitation. Legal phrasing has always felt to me like architecture made of words, precise, load-bearing clauses that decide how a life stands. I read the clause twice, then a third time, as if repetition might rearrange the letters into truth. My name, in a script I knew but hadn't written, was across the signature line. Forged, my stomach supplied before my mind could, the way a building supplies sagging beams after an unseen storm. The date under it read September 14th, 2024. The same weekend I was under anesthesia for a follow-up after my stroke. I remembered waking in a ward smelling of antiseptic and sleep, nurses talking in low, hurried voices. I remembered the fog in my head, the plastic cup of water placed by a gloved hand. I did not remember signing anything. My hands trembled. I held the paper with both palms as if it might dissolve. The phone on the counter blinked 3%. I dialed the number printed on the letterhead before I could think better of it. "Barnes & Cooper, how may I direct your call?" "A receptionist, efficient and clipped. This is Thomas Reed. I'd like to verify a signature, one that apparently isn't mine." My voice was calmer than I felt. There was a pause long enough to sketch doubt. "Who referred you?" "My daughter," I said, softer than I meant. Unfortunately, the woman put me on hold. Music filled my kitchen for a few minutes, a tinny saxophone that sounded like genteel waiting. Then a man's voice, smoother, practiced. "Mr. Reed? This is Richard Barnes." He was mid-50s by the cadence, professional, with that economy of inflection lawyers cultivate. "You received a draft?" "Yes," I swallowed. "There's a document naming my house for consolidation. It has my signature dated while I was hospitalized." I could hear my pulse in my ear. There was a brief rustle. A chair, perhaps. "Mr. Reed, your daughter and her husband indicated you authorized power of attorney last year. They supplied the necessary forms." His tone was careful, conciliatory. "Supposedly signed while I was sedated," I said. "I was under anesthesia on September 14th. I have hospital records." "I can bring them." The line went quiet. I could almost hear the legal machinery recalibrating. "Bring them," Barnes said finally. "Come to my office. Let's look at everything together." I apologize for any alarm. We arranged to meet 2 days later in a small cafe near his firm, one of those places where the tables were too close and people talked softly about important things. Barnes wore a grey suit that might have been expensive enough to hush the room. His handshake was steady. He opened the folder I'd brought with rehearsed sympathy, then stopped when he reached the hospital discharge papers. "Mr. Reed," he said, voice changing in a way I recognized from courtroom dramas, into something alarmed and human. "This shows you were sedated from 9:20 a.m. until 4:15 p.m. on September 14th. There's an anesthesia consent form here, signed by a nurse, and the physician's notes indicate you were not coherent until after 6 p.m. He lifted his glasses and looked at me directly. "If your signature on our draft is dated that day, then, well, that changes everything." The phrase landed like a beam snapping into place. My throat tightened, then cleared. "It's not a mistake," I said. "Someone forged my signature." Barnes set the folder down slowly. "I'll need to pull the originals and compare signatures, Mr. Reed. Firm policy, verification, chain of custody." "But," he hesitated, "we also have the paperwork your daughter and son-in-law submitted claiming full authority to act in your interest." "Submitted while I slept," I said. The words tasted metallic. He leaned forward. "These things happen. Sometimes families make pragmatic choices under stress. But forging a signature is fraud. That's a criminal matter if proven." I had imagined 1,000 responses in the first dizzy minutes after finding the letter. Anger, pleading, bargaining. What surprised me was the exactness of my reaction, clarity. The grief I'd been carrying, raw and private, shifted. It sharpened into a tool. This was not an accident or a mercy. It was calculated control. How did they justify it? I asked. Barnes rubbed his temple. They argued undue risk and your declining capacity. Basically, they painted this as protective. It's persuasive to some lawyers. He spoke the phrase like a professional reading a structural report. Declining capacity. That's what they'd call old walls, that crack. How neat. How clinical. That's not protection, I said. That's replacement. I'll start by getting a handwriting analysis, Barnes said. I'll file a hold on any transfers until we confirm. If the signature is forged, and from what you've said it may well be, we'll proceed. You'll want to consider both civil and criminal remedies. Outside, a late spring sun softened the street, making everything look like a photograph. Inside the cafe, Barnes's words formed a map. There would be filings, subpoenas, signatures to compare, perhaps a police statement. It was work, bureaucratic, stubborn, necessary. For the first time since Emily's car disappeared down Route 302, I felt the shape of a purpose. The drive home that evening felt different. The house greeted me like an old friend with a secret. I walked through rooms that remembered Laura's hands, the small scar on the doorframe where she'd once caught a pan, the faint pencil marks of Emily's height on the pantry wall. The world had not shifted. My perspective had. At the piano, my fingers hovered above dusted keys. I didn't play a chord. I let my hand rest, feeling the lacquer's coolness under my skin, the weight of years pressing back. The instrument held the imprint of her, like a signature in varnish. "You were right," I whispered into the quiet house, the words addressing more than the wood. Love without respect isn't love at all. It was not the sound of surrender. It was the sound of a man beginning to shore up his own foundations. Rain has a strange way of cleaning the world while making it heavier. When Grace's old sedan pulled up outside their townhouse, the street glistened like polished stone, and the sky pressed low against the rooftops. She turned off the engine, leaving the wipers clicking once more before stillness. "You sure you want to go in alone?" she asked. I looked at her, the only person who'd treated me like a man instead of a liability these past weeks. "If I bring someone with me," I said softly, "it becomes a war." "Alone, it's just truth," she nodded once. "I'll wait." I took the manila folder from the seat beside me, the one containing my hospital records, the signature analysis, and Richard Barnes's written statement confirming forgery, and stepped out into the rain. It had that clean metallic smell, the kind that wakes memory more than skin. By the time I reached their porch, my coat was already damp at the shoulders. The doorbell chimed a sterile note. Emily opened it after a moment, her expression flickering between surprise and guilt. "Dad," she began, voice bright and trembling. I didn't expect to be left on a highway either." The words landed quiet but unmissable. Her face tightened, lips parting in a small gasp she couldn't disguise. "May I come in?" I asked. She stepped aside automatically, the politeness of a daughter warring with the fear of a trespasser. The living room smelled faintly of candles and disinfectant, curated comfort. Rain streaked the big bay windows, thunder murmuring somewhere far off. Jason was at the dining table, laptop open, sleeves rolled up like a man halfway between business and defense. He didn't rise when I entered. "Well," he said, his tone almost genial. "This is unexpected." I placed the manila folder on the coffee table. "It shouldn't be. We have unfinished business." Emily shut the door quietly behind me, her hands twisting at her sleeves. "Dad, I wish you'd called." "We could have prepared?" I asked. "Rehearsed?" She flinched at the word. Jason leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Look, Tom, Mr. Reed," I corrected, my voice still calm. "Let's use formalities since you prefer legal precision." Jason's smile faltered. I opened the folder. "This," I said, sliding a sheet forward, "is a letter from Richard Barnes, confirming that the signature on your trust documents was not mine. The date aligns with my hospital records, here, which show I was under anesthesia from 9 to 4 that day. Which means," Jason's jaw tightened, "you're jumping to conclusions." "Am I?" I asked. I unfolded another paper, crisp and deliberate. "Barnes also confirmed that these forms were submitted by you and Emily together, with witness lines unsigned." Emily's voice came small, fragile. "Dad, we just wanted to make sure things were secure." "You've been through so much, and secure from what?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. "From confusion. From things getting complicated if something happened to you." "Something did happen," I said. "To my trust. To my name." Jason finally stood, resting both palms on the table as if to assert control. "We weren't stealing, Tom. We were protecting assets, making sure nothing got lost in probate. You have to understand, these are normal estate strategies." I met his gaze. "Strategies built on lies aren't strategy. They're theft with spreadsheets." He exhaled sharply, glancing at Emily for backup. "We didn't take anything." "We just moved it," I interrupted. "Consolidated it. Prepared for my incapacitation." Jason's mouth opened, but no words came. I turned my attention to Emily. "Tell me," I said, voice steady, "was it you or Jason who signed my name?" Her throat moved once, twice, but no sound came out. The rain filled the silence for her, heavy, insistent. Finally, she whispered, "Dad, you don't understand. We thought it was for the best. You were still recovering, and Jason said," I repeated. "And you listened." Tears welled in her eyes. "We just wanted to make sure you wouldn't what?" I asked softly. "Outlive your patience?" The room went utterly still. The sound of the rain outside deepened, a rolling percussion against glass. Jason moved around the table, a defensive smirk twitching at his lips. "You're twisting this into drama. You're hurt, I get it. But we didn't mean—" "Don't confuse intent with innocence," I said. Emily turned to him, her voice breaking. "Jason, stop." He froze mid-sentence. She looked back at me, eyes glistening. Dad, I swear I didn't know it was wrong. He said it was just a legal formality. Formality doesn't need forgery, I said. Only fear does. Jason muttered something under his breath, a string of irritation disguised as reason. You're making this harder than it needs to be. You're lucky we even thought ahead. I looked at him then, really looked. The way I used to study foundations in old buildings, to see where the cracks began. You think foresight excuses deceit? You took the trust of a man who built you a home and treated it like unclaimed property. Jason straightened, hands balling into fists. You're being ridiculous. No, I said quietly. This is respect, reclaiming its key. Thunder rolled, low and distant, punctuating the sentence like punctuation crafted by the sky itself. Emily sank onto the couch, shoulders folding inward. Her mascara smudged slightly. She looked small in the expensive room she'd once begged me to help renovate. I took a breath and spoke the rest of it cleanly, like a man reading final blueprints. I've revoked every authorization tied to my estate. The house is now legally sealed under my name alone. Barnes filed the paperwork this morning. The locks are changed. You will not step inside until you remember what home means. Jason laughed once, a single brittle sound. You can't just... I can, I said. And I did. He took a step closer. You're cutting yourself off from your only family. Then maybe family isn't what I thought it was. Emily's hands were trembling. Dad, please. I didn't mean for it to end like this, I asked. No one ever does. But you made a choice, Emily. You signed away trust the way some people sign receipts, quickly, thoughtlessly. Her tears came in silence, the kind that fall too heavily to wipe away. Jason moved toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Come on, babe. He's emotional. Let's not make it worse. She shook him off. Stop talking like that. His face darkened. Like what? Like he's not my father, she said through her tears. Jason's mouth tightened. He's trying to make us look... I said stop! She snapped, her voice cracking through the room. For a moment, the three of us stood there, framed by the storm outside and the hollow quiet inside. The thunder, the rain, and the shallow sound of breathing. It was all that existed. I stepped back, gathering the folder. You wanted to simplify things, I said, my tone softer now. I have. My affairs, my property, my peace, my all back in order. The only thing left complicated is your conscience. Emily buried her face in her hands. Jason exhaled hard, muttering, This is insane. I reached for the door. No, I said. It's overdue. The rain met me immediately, cool and cleansing. Grace was still there, engine idling softly, headlights casting a pale reflection over the wet asphalt. I looked back once, not for permission or regret, but for acknowledgement. Through the window, I saw Emily sitting alone on the couch, Jason pacing behind her, gesturing, already rationalizing. The scene looked like something from a painting, figures trapped in their own architecture. Grace leaned out as I opened the car door. You all right? I nodded, lighter than I've felt in years. She looked past me toward the house. Did they listen? I didn't go there to be heard, I said. I went there to be clear. Grace gave a small smile. Then you did it. As we drove away, the rain thickened, drumming on the roof like applause muffled by distance. The road blurred ahead, but for the first time in months, the direction felt right. I watched the reflections of passing lights slide across the window, fleeting streaks of gold and white. They reminded me of Laura's piano keys in the morning light, the ones I used to polish even after she was gone. She used to tell me that dignity isn't about winning. It's about knowing where to stop bowing. Tonight I understood her completely. The thunder broke once more, then softened into the rhythm of retreating rain. Behind me, the house where my daughter lived glowed faintly in the rear view, warm, expensive, and hollow. Ahead, the road curved toward the dark, where the only sound left was the whisper of tires on wet pavement and the quiet pulse of a heart that finally, fully, stood its ground. The week after the confrontation felt like a different season. Richard Barnes called first thing Monday and said simply, "Everything's processed. The revocations are in effect. We've placed a legal hold on transfers until the police finish their review." His voice had the flat calm of someone closing a file. I thanked him and hung up, as if a small mechanism in my life had finally stopped grinding. A detective from the county station visited 2 days later. He crouched to examine the signature sample Barnes had secured, tapping a pen against his notepad. "Forgery's clear from a handwriting standpoint," he said. "We've opened a criminal inquiry. We'll likely subpoena records, but we're already coordinating with the firm. Mr. Reed, you did the right thing coming forward." "You think they'll be charged?" I asked. "That's for the DA to decide," he said. "But resignations and internal actions speed things along." He paused. "Jason resigned yesterday, before his board meeting." Resigned. The word was anticlimactic and perfect, a polished sort of exit that left no sticky residue for others to treat. No scuffle in the papers, no public spectacle. It was simply a quiet removing of a name from a ledger. 3 envelopes arrived over the next few days. Emily's handwriting was recognizable, the same slant she'd used when labeling my childhood drawings. Each letter lay unopened on my kitchen counter, as if they were small, fragile petitions waiting for me to decide whether to answer. Grace brought soup that afternoon, steam fogging the small windows. She stood on my porch for a moment, letting the rain-slicked air move around her. "How's the quiet treating you?" she asked, setting the thermos down on my table. "Peaceful," I said. "Loud sometimes, but peaceful." I put my hand on the thermos, feeling its heat through paper. The kitchen smelled of onions and thyme, the scent sheltering in the corners. She sat at the table without being asked, folding her hands around her mug like a prayer. "You did the right thing, Tom. You didn't lash out. You closed what needed closing." "I was tired of being polite to theft," I replied. Grace looked at me in that way she always did, an assessment but not judgment. "You ever want company while you read them, I'm nearby." I appreciated that offer more than I said. Instead, I waited, watching the rain gather on the sill. Days folded into a routine. I repaired a chair whose leg had been loosened for years, sanding the joint until it fit snug as memory. I stripped the lacquer off an old side table and replanted its grain with walnut oil, watching the wood drink in color like an apology answered. Each small, deliberate motion felt like prayer. Once, while I was reconditioning the lock on the pantry, Doctor, the same drawer where Laura had kept her recipes, I thought about all the little mechanical things that hold a home together: hinges, screws, the balance of a doorknob. Respect was one of those small mechanisms, I realized. Once its threads were stripped, nothing closed properly. A week into the quiet, I found a note stuck to my front gate, a single sheet with a scribbled apology. Not from Emily, from a neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, who'd watched the whole thing unfold from her azaleas. "You did good, Thomas," it read in careful blue ink. "Sometimes it takes a slow hand to fix a quick wrong." The police called occasionally, asking for clarifications. Barnes sent updates. The DA's office requested more records. The world of legal motion moved in precise, small steps, like a builder verifying a foundation plate. None of it was loud. None of it invited cameras. Then, on a bright Thursday afternoon, I found myself standing at the mailbox. I had written a short note the night before and left it unsigned on my kitchen table, but in the morning I walked it to the curb and slid it into the mailbox. It felt less like a letter than a small tool, something intended to shape behavior without spectacle. Grace came by that afternoon with 2 coffee mugs and the same old thermos, sitting on my porch steps as if she'd been doing that for years. "You wrote her?" she asked, nodding toward the mailbox. I shrugged. "I left something." I didn't. Mentioned that there were 3 unopened letters still on the counter. She sipped her coffee and watched me fumble under the sink for a wrench. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm learning to enjoy the mechanics of things again," I said. "And to accept that not all repair is public." She smiled. "Some repairs are for you. Some are for later." That night I sat at the piano and ran a single scale, slow and deliberate, The key felt cool under my finger. Dust yielded like seasons making room. The sound was thin at first, then rounded like a bell. I didn't try to summon Laura's voice, only to measure the wood, the air, the possibility that a room could breathe again. The next morning, when I opened the door, a thin envelope lay on the step. Not a letter from Emily, not from the DA. It was a card from Barnes's assistant. All revocations confirmed. We will hold for further instruction. Practical, the way a blueprint is practical. It meant the house was mine, legally and functionally, and that the world would enforce that boundary. I never put the unopened letters back into the mailbox. They sat on the counter like standing invitations to conversation. Sometimes, late at night, I would move them from one side of the counter to the other and back again, like testing a hinge for stiffness. People called me and left messages, some awkward and searching. An old client asked if I'd consider a small consulting job, a single, tasteful restoration that would keep my hand honest. I declined at first, then accepted the next morning. The work felt right, not an obligation to anyone, but a choice I could measure. Emily never came by. Her letters stayed closed, each envelope a small silence. Once I thought about opening one, eating whatever apology or plea it might contain, but I feared dissolving the boundary I had built. Forgiveness is a doorway. Sometimes it's necessary to wait until the person on the other side has learned to knock properly. In the evenings, Grace and I would share dinners, stew, bread, the kind of food that sits warmly in your hands. We swapped small confidences. "You'll be surprised who remembers you," she said once. "May not be the faces you expect." I found that true. The carpenter down the lane fixed my back gate without asking for money. An acquaintance from the Architecture Guild sent over a stack of journals he thought I'd like. The neighborhood, in its slow way, stitched itself around me. One quiet dawn, I walked to the mailbox and found a single fold of paper tucked under the lip. It was Emily's handwriting, but the paper was thick and the envelope unsealed. Inside, a single sentence: "I'm sorry." No plea, no explanation, just a word that carried the weight of many things. I folded it and placed it on top of the counter, beside the other letters. That afternoon I made a new key. I filed it in a small tin, not for show, not for ceremony, but as a practical measure. I thought about how many locks exist in life that aren't metal: promises, habits, patterns. Some you change the cylinder on, some you choose never to hand the key back. At dusk, Grace came by and we sat on the porch, the sky a smear of violet. "How are you?" she asked, as if asking about the weather and the spirit at once. "Better," I said. Less brittle, less surprised by people. I expected more drama and got quiet. It's honest. She reached out and squeezed my hand. "You gave her everything that mattered. Now you can give yourself the quiet to keep it straight." I looked down at the stack of papers on the counter, unopened, opened a little, and one small apology folded thin. Justice, I learned in those weeks, didn't always arrive with applause or vindication. Sometimes it showed up as paperwork, as a changed lock, as a neighbor's note. Sometimes it was a quiet restoration of the things you actually needed. A door that closed, a chair that stood straight, a piano that could still sing. Before bed, I wrote something brief and left it unsigned in the mailbox for Emily, not because I needed to be heard, but because doors, like people, sometimes have to wait for readiness. When you learn the weight of trust, you'll understand why some doors stay closed until then. Then I turned off the light, and the house held me, steady, patient, and finally mine. 6 months later, the light changed. Spring sunlight slipped through the half-drawn blinds, soft and hesitant, dust motes drifting like the slow breath of the house. My pencil moved steadily over the paper. A new sketch, not for anyone but myself. The graphite line was clean, unhurried. The sound it made, that faint, precise rasp, had become the rhythm of my mornings. From the next room came a sound I hadn't heard in years: music. Grace sat at Laura's piano, her hands coaxing a quiet melody out of keys that had waited too long. She played gently, as though afraid to wake something sacred. The notes wandered through the house like sunlight touching forgotten walls. I paused my drawing, listening. It wasn't perfect, one key was still flat, but the imperfection made it human. Real. Grace smiled when she noticed me at the doorway. "Thought it was time your house remembered its own song," she said. "It never forgot," I replied. "It was just waiting for the right hands. We shared coffee most mornings now. Her thermos had become part of the kitchen. The loneliness that once echoed here had thinned, replaced by something calmer. A new routine had taken shape, morning walks through the park, afternoons volunteering at the local library, evenings spent writing small columns for the community paper. They'd asked me to write about architecture at first, but what came out instead were essays about inheritance and integrity, how we build things, and how easily they can be taken apart when respect isn't part of the design. To my surprise, people wrote back. Letters came from widows, sons, daughters, people who'd lost property, trust, or love, all to the same quiet betrayals. They thanked me for putting words to what they couldn't say. I never answered most of them. Some pain needs silence to stay honest. Grace teased that I'd become a local philosopher. I told her I was just a man writing his own repair manual. Then, one Sunday morning, a letter arrived. The handwriting stopped me cold. I knew the curve of that capital E, the slight left slant on every Y. Emily. The envelope was thin, unassuming, no return address. I sat for a long time before opening it, tracing my thumb along the flap as though it might reveal intent. When I finally read it, the words were careful, deliberate. "Dad, I've spent months thinking about what I did, about what it means to love someone but try to control the shape of their life anyway. I used to think I was protecting you. Now I know I was protecting my own comfort. You didn't make me feel small. I did that myself. Thank you for making me face myself. I'm sorry it had to happen the way it did. No plea for forgiveness. No defense. Just honesty, plain and trembling. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. The paper smelled faintly of lavender soap, her mother's favorite scent. Grace peeked into the room. "Everything all right?" I nodded. "Better than all right." She glanced at the letter, then back at me. "She wrote?" She did. Grace walked closer, resting her hand briefly on my shoulder. "You going to write back?" "Not yet," I said. "Maybe not at all. Sometimes the reply is in how we keep living." Outside, the morning was cool and bright. I took my coat, the old keyring jangling in my hand, and stepped onto the porch. The lock clicked behind me, solid, clean, final. For years, that sound had meant protection. Now, it sounded like peace. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the early hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block and the distant bark of a dog. The air carried that wet, green smell of thawed earth. I stood there for a long moment, breathing it in. The house behind me, once a museum of loss, now felt alive again. There were faint piano notes still floating through the open window, and somewhere inside, the kettle was beginning to hiss. I thought about everything that had brought me here. The highway, the forged signature, the rain against glass, my daughter's trembling voice. Every act of betrayal had been an invitation to see myself clearly, and I had accepted. I reached into my pocket and touched the new key, the one I'd made months ago after changing the locks. Its edges had smoothed from use, its brass surface warm from my palm. It wasn't a symbol of defense anymore. It was continuity. Proof that I could open and close what I chose, not from fear, but from balance. Grace's music drifted again through the open window. A gentle chord, a pause, then the melody resolving like forgiveness that didn't need to be declared. I smiled, turned toward the gate, and said quietly to the wind, to Laura, to the world that had tested me in all the ways it knew how. It wasn't punishment I wanted. It was dignity, restored by the turn of a key.